This video is brought to you by USF World at the University of South Florida. During World War II, the U.S. Army Air Forces reported at least 620 aircraft and 1,700 airmen missing on combat missions in the China theater, that is, China, Indochina, and Thailand. Less than 5% of these airmen fell into Japanese hands. 31% are known to have died in the crash or bailout, and 22% are still listed as missing in action. More than 40% returned safely to American air bases. The percentage of dead and missing, now presumed dead of course, is similar to Allied aircraft operating over occupied Europe. In other words, no matter which theater you were flying in, you had a little worse than 50-50 odds for surviving the crash or bailout if you went down. The difference between Europe and China, though, is what happened after the crash or bailout. Underground organizations in Europe delivered less than a quarter of downed airmen back to Allied control. In China, if you survived, you had a 90% chance of returning to friendly territory. More than 700 rescued airmen owed their lives to ordinary Chinese soldiers and civilians who helped them escape the Japanese. Incredibly, this history remains largely unknown in the United States today. In looking into the fate of America's missing airmen in China during World War II, this video will briefly discuss the origins of the Sino-Japanese War and how the United States became involved, some challenges to cooperation between the United States and China, the guerrilla air war fought by the Flying Tigers of the American Volunteer Group, China Air Task Force, and 14th Army Air Force, and some patterns to evasion and resistance. What would become World War II began in Asia with what is known as the Marco Polo Bridge Incident on July 7, 1937. In truth, Japanese imperialism had been on the rise for decades. July 1937 just marked the point it tipped into full-scale war. The Imperial Japanese Army quickly overran Beijing and swept across the North China Plains. Its troops defeated nationalist China's best divisions in savage urban fighting around Shanghai and Nanjing, and ruthlessly punished the Chinese people for their resistance. They continued the drive up the Yangtze River to Zhejiang and finally Hankou. The deaths of hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children attended each of these conquests. The Chinese Air Force could only launch a hodgepodge fleet of obsolete airplanes against the state-of-the-art Japanese Air Force, which quickly gained air superiority. By the summer of 1941, Japan controlled China's skies along with 95% of its industry, 1/4 its area, and half its population. But its land offensive had ground to a halt. In the north, Kai-shek ordered his generals to breach the Yellow River dams to stop the enemy advance. In the center, General Shuai put up a remarkably successful defense at Changsha. In the south, a determined counterattack by 2 Chinese armored divisions succeeded at stopping the enemy at Kunlun Pass. From 1939 until 1944, the situation on the ground remained a stalemate. Unable to advance on the ground and in complete control of the air, the Japanese decided to bomb China into submission. In May 1939, they began relentless terror attacks against cities such as Chongqing and Kunming. The Chinese Air Force kept trying to repel the raids, but in August 1940, the Japanese unleashed their new Mitsubishi A6M Type 0 carrier fighter. The Zero was unstoppable. In a raid on Chongqing on September 13, 1940, 13 Zeros downed 13 Chinese fighters and seriously damaged 11 more, killing 10 pilots and injuring 9 without taking any losses. Pretty soon, the Chinese didn't have an air force to speak of. They endured the bombing courageously, but Chiang Kai-shek knew his nationalist regime could not hold on for long without help from the outside. Meanwhile, Claire Lee Chennault had arrived in China on May 31, 1937, just 6 weeks before the war began. He was a retired U.S. Army Air Corps captain, having left the service because of his radical views on fighter aviation and because of poor health. Song Mei-ling, the wife of Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek, hired him to make a comprehensive evaluation of the Chinese Air Force. What he saw didn't impress him much, but once the war broke out, he had an opportunity to watch the Japanese and study their tactics. With the Chinese Air Force in tatters, Chiang dispatched him to the United States in November 1940 to lobby for a volunteer fighter group manned by experienced American aviators. President Franklin Roosevelt felt the United States had a clear imperative for helping China. Citing the open door policy, he wanted to ensure its trade remained open to all nations, rather than falling under the exclusive domination of the Japanese. He also saw Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government as becoming a stabilizing, democratic influence in the Far East. Whether or not that was realistic, in the short term, amidst rising tensions between the United States and Japan, tying up 1 million troops in China had certain advantages. Roosevelt gave his verbal authorization for the formation of an American volunteer group, later known as the Flying Tigers, to defend the Burma Road into China. They began arriving in Burma to train in the fall of 1941. They hadn't yet seen any action before the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th. By May 1942, an unstoppable Japanese army had conquered Burma and cut off China's last link to the outside world. The U.S.-Chinese alliance was now official, but fraught with challenges. China was still largely agrarian, especially the areas left unconquered by the Japanese. China didn't have much industry of its own, and the only way to get war material into the country was by air. Transports took off from India and flew over what became known as the Hump, a perilous spur of mountains jutting south from the Himalayas into Burma. Battling the terrain, the weather, and the Japanese, air crews soon came to call it the Aluminum Trail for the hundreds of aircraft lost along the way. Another challenge was the lack of political cohesion in China. America was officially allied with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government in Chongqing, but the war eroded much of his traditional power base and left him dependent on warlords and semi-autonomous provinces. Corruption, inflation, and black marketeering ran rampant. To the north, headquartered in Yan'an, Mao Zedong led the Chinese Communist Party, which opposed Chiang but also fought the Japanese. There were also collaborationist governments that worked for the Japanese but sometimes cooperated with the nationalists or the communists. It made for a bizarre, confusing, multi-sided war that few Americans could wrap their heads around. With nearly the entire world at war, Claire Chennault found himself in command of an air force at the end of the world's longest supply line and at the bottom of a long list of priorities. He had to fight on a shoestring, but fight he did, an aggressive guerrilla air war against often formidable odds. To do this, he harnessed a vast network of airfields and a system of spotters to warn of incoming enemy air raids. Even before the United States entered the war, China had embarked on a construction project as great as the Great Wall in scale and consequence. A nation without an air force to speak of built over 100 airfields from Yunnan province in the southwest to Fujian in the east, an area spanning over 400,000 square miles. They built every single one of those airfields by hand. Thousands of men, women, and children digging foundations sometimes 5 feet deep to accommodate heavy bombers, and filling it with layers of gravel and mud. They quarried the stone by hand, carried it in baskets on their backs, crushed it into gravel, and laid it in the ground, all without modern machinery. They packed down each layer and leveled it smooth with enormous concrete rollers pulled by up to 200 people. This vast network of fields allowed Chennault to play a continual shell game with the Japanese, keeping them guessing where he would launch his next blow from. Chennault had first written about his ideas for an air raid warning net while teaching at the Air Corps Tactical School in Alabama in the early 1930s. The war in China finally gave him a chance to try it. He'd created a network of people, radios, telephones, and telegraph lines that covered all of free China. The observers reported sightings of enemy aircraft to a central command post, where fighter controllers would then plot the raids to determine their target and launch fighters to intercept. The warning net acted as a force multiplier, allowing Chennault to concentrate his forces against a numerically superior foe. In the American Volunteer Group's first air battle on December 20th, 1941, the warning net allowed Chennault to ambush the Japanese bombers before they reached Kunming. His shark-mouthed P-40s claimed 4 out of 10 enemy airplanes destroyed for no losses. The Japanese Army Air Force refrained from bombing Kunming for 16 months. The city's inhabitants were ecstatic. This feeling of finally seeing someone fight back after they had been bombed, defenseless for so long, this feeling is what lies at the root of why so many downed American airmen were rescued in China. Chennault's airmen didn't stay on the defensive. They aggressively attacked the Japanese wherever they could find them. American airplanes ranged across the entire country. American airmen bailed out or crash-landed in 29 of modern China's 34 province-level divisions. American warplanes and evading airmen became the most visible signs of resistance against the Japanese, proof positive the invader hadn't won and that resistance continued. The first test of evasion on an industrial scale was in the wake of the Doolittle raid. 16 Army B-25 bombers launched from the USS Hornet and bombed targets in Japan. 15 of them made it to China, where their crews crashed or bailed out in the dark. No one in China knew about it, not even Chennault. Nobody bothered to tell him. 75 airmen suddenly descended on Zhejiang, Jiangxi, and Anhui provinces. The Japanese captured only 8 of them. 3 died, but without warning or preparation, the Chinese rescued the remaining 64. It wouldn't have been possible with just troops and nationalist officials. Ordinary Chinese civilians helped the airmen reach safety. There was no system, not at the point of contact at least. The rescue of American airmen in many ways was a grassroots response to the Japanese occupation. What those civilians got in return for their help was terrible revenge by the Japanese troops, though. In the wake of the Doolittle raid, they launched a punitive expedition that razed every village through which they thought the raiders had passed. In the process, they slaughtered over 200,000 men, women, and children. The Imperial Japanese Army made it clear. The consequences for helping the Americans extended to your family and your village. But remember I said the Doolittle raid was one of the first examples of evasion. Despite the high price they paid for helping the Americans, the rescue of over 700 China-based American airmen mostly happened later, after the Imperial Army concluded its campaign of revenge. In other words, the Chinese knew the cost, but they chose to help anyway. This help was also not restricted to areas under nationalist influence. Roughly 12% of downed American airmen were rescued by communist troops. Some were even rescued by alleged collaborators. In a country riven by political division, rescuing Americans was something that rose above politics. Why is this important today, though? Why does this story matter? Now, the United States and China are the most powerful nations in the world, and their relationship is the most important in the world. Rivalry is the word most would use to describe it, a sometimes dangerous rivalry. Remembering a time when we worked together for a common cause can help us find cooperation instead of conflict in the 21st century. Hopefully, this will be the legacy of America's missing airmen in China during World War II.